each year military reconnaissance units operating within the continental United States report encounters with unexplained phenomena during routine training exercises incidents. So disturbing that the Department of Defense maintains a classified division specifically tasked with investigating what they internally refer to as domestic anomalous events, with an estimated annual budget exceeding $200 million that never appears in any public congressional oversight documents. During the height of Cold War tensions in 1971, approximately 340,000 American military personnel were stationed at bases across the southwestern United States, conducting constant readiness drills in terrain deliberately chosen for its similarity to potential Soviet deployment zones in Central Asia and the Middle East. The Superstition Mountains of Arizona, covering roughly 650 square kilometers of some of the most treacherous and unforgiving landscape in North America, had been the site of over 120 documented disappearances since the 1840s, with the Apache tribes who originally inhabited the region warning that the mountains were protected by something far older and far more vengeful than any human authority could comprehend. For a brief period during the scorching summer of July 1971, an elite reconnaissance unit from Fort Huachuca would stumble upon something so impossibly ancient and so deliberately hidden that it would force the Pentagon to establish protocols that remain classified to this very day. But what exactly was the entity that the Apache had called "He Who Guards the Burning Gold"? And why did 12 battle-tested soldiers vanish from all official military records, as if their entire existence had been methodically erased from history itself? The Superstition Mountains rise abruptly from the Sonoran desert floor like the jagged spine of some prehistoric beast there is. Rust-colored peaks reaching elevations of nearly 6,000 feet and casting shadows across approximately 650 square kilometers of terrain so hostile that even experienced outdoorsmen have described it as deliberately malevolent. The geological formations create a natural labyrinth of narrow canyons, dead-end ravines, and towering cliff faces that seem to shift and rearrange themselves depending on the angle of approach, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the exposed areas, while hidden caves maintain an unnatural coldness that feels wrong against the skin. The region sits just 40 miles east of Phoenix, close enough to civilization that disappearances seem impossible to explain, yet isolated enough that search and rescue operations have repeatedly failed to recover bodies or even basic evidence of what happened to the missing. Spanish conquistadors in the 1540s reported that their Apache guides refused to enter certain valleys, speaking in hushed tones about places where the mountain breathes, and warning that those who took from the earth without permission would be claimed by something they called the Keeper of Stolen Centuries. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this same brutal landscape would become the perfect training ground for Cold War reconnaissance units preparing for deployment to equally unforgiving territories behind the Iron Curtain, with military planners viewing the mountain's reputation for danger as an asset rather than a deterrent, believing that soldiers who could survive the superstitions could survive anywhere on Earth. The legend of the Lost Dutchman mine had persisted for over a century before American military forces began using the area rooted in the story of a German immigrant named Jacob Waltz, who supposedly discovered an extraordinarily rich gold deposit somewhere in the mountains during the 1870s. According to historical accounts that have been partially verified through period newspapers and court documents, Waltz would periodically emerge from the wilderness, carrying ore samples so pure that assayers claimed they had never seen anything comparable, with gold content exceeding 90% in some specimens. The old prospector allegedly murdered at least 8 men who tried to follow him back to his source, displaying a pathological obsession with protecting the mine's location that went far beyond normal prospectors' greed, with witnesses reporting that Waltz seemed to age backwards during his final years, looking younger and stronger each time he returned from the mountains, despite being well into his 70s. On his deathbed in 1891, Waltz supposedly provided cryptic directions to the mind, speaking in a mixture of German and what sounded like an ancient language that none of the attendants recognized, describing the entrance as where the shadow of the tip touches the stone when the sun dies, and warning that the gold remembers every hand that touched it, and it always takes payment. What most historians dismissed as the fever dreams of a dying man took on darker significance when, between 1892 and 1895, 11 separate expeditions entered the superstition searching for Waltz's mine, and only 3 survivors returned. All of them found wandering the desert in various states of psychological collapse, speaking about a Dutch ghost that walked through solid rock and a sound like grinding metal that came from beneath the earth itself. Military records that remained classified until 1994 reveal that the Army was aware of the mountain's disturbing history when they designated the area as a training zone in 1969, with internal memos specifically referencing the high disappearance rate as useful for testing soldiers' psychological resilience under stress. Between 1969 and early 1971, at least 4 separate incidents occurred involving military personnel experiencing what official reports termed acute environmental disorientation syndrome, a conveniently vague diagnosis that covered everything from hallucinations to complete mental breakdowns. A Marine Corps survival training unit in October 1969 reported that 2 of their instructors vanished during a night navigation exercise, with the only trace being their boots found placed side by side on a rock outcropping 3 miles from their last known position, the leather showing signs of extreme heat exposure despite no evidence of fire. An Army Ranger squad conducting desert warfare training in March 1970 radioed in frantic reports of someone or something tracking their movements through the canyons, describing a figure that appeared to be wearing outdated mining clothes from the 1800s, but moved with impossible speed across terrain that should have been impassable. The official explanation blamed heat exhaustion and dehydration, but the recording of their final transmission, which was conveniently lost for 2 decades before being leaked to researchers, captured something that sounded distinctly like German being spoken in the background, along with what acoustic analysis later identified as the sound of pickaxes striking stone, despite the Rangers being miles from any known mining sites. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to look beyond the official explanations. Similar encounters were reported consistently in the same general area of the mountains, a remote region the Apache had called Si Nidaji Kine, which translates roughly to the place where time folds back on itself. July 19, 1971, 0600 hours. The temperature already climbing past 90 degrees as 12 soldiers from the 111th Military Intelligence Battalion's Special Reconnaissance Detachment assembled at the western approach to the Superstition Mountains, their mission briefing having been delivered in a secure room at Fort Huachuca just 18 hours earlier. Staff Sergeant Vincent Harlow, a 32-year-old career soldier from rural Montana with 3 tours in Germany under his belt, and a reputation for unshakable composure that had earned him the call sign Granite, stood checking his equipment with a methodical precision that came from 15 years of military discipline, his weathered face showing no emotion as he reviewed the classified orders that made absolutely no sense from a tactical perspective. The official mission parameters stated they were to locate and document a suspected Soviet observation post that intelligence analysts believed had been established somewhere in the mountain range, supposedly part of a broader infiltration network designed to monitor American ICBM facilities in Arizona and New Mexico. But Harlow had studied enough Cold War intelligence to know that the superstitions were too remote and too visible from nearby roads to make any strategic sense as a spy base. Beside him, Corporal James Rabbit Patterson, a 24-year-old communications specialist from New Orleans who'd gotten his nickname for an almost supernatural ability to squeeze through impossibly tight spaces during urban warfare training, was triple-checking their radio equipment with unusual nervousness, repeatedly testing the frequencies and muttering that something about the atmospheric readings felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering him. The rest of the unit consisted of seasoned professionals. Specialist Eddie Reeves, their demolitions expert, and a former college geology student who'd volunteered, specifically because he wanted to search for the lost Dutchman mine during off hours. Private First Class Tommy Birch, barely 19, but already displaying the marksmanship skills that had made him the youngest person to qualify as an Army sniper. Sergeant First Class Luis Mendoza, their medic, and the only one who spoke Spanish, which command thought might be useful for questioning local civilians. And 7 others, whose names would matter greatly in the hours to come. The morning air carried that peculiar stillness that desert veterans recognize as unnatural, an absence of the normal sounds of wildlife and wind that suggested animals had abandoned the area entirely. And when Reeves mentioned this observation with a nervous laugh, Harlow felt something cold settle in his stomach, despite the climbing heat, a premonition he couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. They pushed into the mountains following coordinates that intelligence had provided, working their way up a narrow canyon that seemed to grow, progressively darker despite the sun climbing toward its zenith overhead, the rock walls rising on either side like the interior of a massive throat, slowly swallowing them deeper into the earth itself. By 1300 hours, they'd covered approximately 8 kilometers of brutal terrain, the temperature inside the canyon somehow 20 degrees cooler than it should have been, their breath occasionally visible in small clouds, despite the thermometer reading 85 degrees, a physical impossibility that Mendoza pointed out with increasing concern in his voice. Harlow called for a 10-minute break in a wider section of the canyon where ancient petroglyphs covered the rock face, images that Reeves identified as definitely not Apache in origin, showing figures that looked almost human, but with proportions that were subtly wrong, elongated limbs and heads that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. Patterson was attempting to establish radio contact with their forward operating base when the equipment suddenly erupted with interference so intense that it physically burned his hand, the handset growing hot enough to blister skin in seconds. And in the static, they all heard it clearly, unmistakably. A voice speaking, German in an accent that linguists would later identify as specific to the Bavaria region of the 1870s, saying over and over, "Ihr seid schon tot, ihr wisst es nur noch nicht," which Mendoza's rusty high school German couldn't translate, but made everyone's skin crawl with instinctive recognition. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees in less than 30 seconds, their breath now coming out in thick clouds. And that's when Private Birch screamed and pointed at the canyon wall where one of the petroglyphs had changed. The figure that had been stationary in the rock now appeared to be in a different position, its elongated arm raised as if waving, and beneath it, someone had carved fresh letters into the stone, the rock dust still crumbling down from the cuts, spelling out a single word in English that definitely hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. Mine. The smell hit them next, a combination of old copper, sulfur, and something organic that reminded Harlow of the mass grave he'd helped excavate during a training exercise at a World War II site. The stench of decomposition mixed with mineral deposits and something else, something that smelled like electricity and burnt hair and pure wrongness that seemed to bypass their noses and register directly in their brainstems as a primal warning to run. Harlow was ordering his men to fall back to the canyon entrance when Specialist Reeves suddenly broke formation and ran toward the northern wall, his eyes wide and unfocused, pointing at something the rest of them couldn't see and shouting that he'd found it. He'd actually found the lost Dutchman mine. The entrance was right. There couldn't they see the gold glinting just inside the opening. 3 soldiers grabbed him before he could reach the solid rock face he was indicating, Reeves fighting with manic strength that required Patterson and 2 others to restrain him, his hands clawing at the stone wall, hard enough to tear his fingernails completely off, blood streaming down the rock as he screamed in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human that the mine wanted him, had been calling him his whole life, and he finally understood that he'd never been meant to die in some foreign war, but right here, right now, becoming part of the mountain forever. Mendoza managed to sedate him with a syringe of morphine from his medical kit, the geological expert's body going limp in their arms, but his eyes remained open and tracking something invisible that moved across the canyon walls. His lips moving in whispered German that none of them had known he could speak. They were preparing an emergency evacuation stretcher when the ground beneath their feet vibrated with a deep, resonant sound like a massive bell being struck far underground, the vibration traveling up through their bones and making their teeth ache. And cracks began appearing in the canyon floor in a pattern that was definitely not natural, forming what looked like letters in an alphabet none of them recognized, but that somehow felt readable, as if the meaning was being transmitted directly into their minds. Payment due. The temperature plummeted to near freezing in seconds, ice forming on the rock walls in patterns that looked like reaching hands. And that's when they all saw him simultaneously, standing at the far end of the canyon where nothing had been seconds before. A man in clothes from another century, holding a pickaxe that gleamed with the dull red color of old blood, his face simultaneously ancient and impossibly young, his eyes reflecting the light in a way that human eyes absolutely should not. And when he smiled, they could see that his teeth had been replaced with nuggets of gold that caught the light and threw it back in painful fragments. Staff Sergeant Vincent Granite Harlow, who'd faced down Soviet armor mock-ups and survived 3 years in the most dangerous parts of Cold War Europe without flinching, felt his bladder release involuntarily as the figure raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or accusation, and Specialist Eddie Reeves suddenly stopped breathing entirely, his body stiffening and his skin taking on a grayish-yellow tint that looked exactly like oxidized gold, his final expression locked in a rictus of ecstasy and absolute terror. And when Mendoza frantically checked for a pulse, he found none. But he did find that Reeves' blood had somehow transformed into a thick, metallic liquid that left golden stains on his fingers, and the body had become so heavy that it took 4 men to lift what should have weighed maybe 180 pounds, but now felt like they were trying to move a statue cast from solid ore. Harlow's training kicked in, despite every instinct screaming at him to abandon the body and run, his voice cracking only slightly as he ordered a tactical retreat back down the canyon while maintaining defensive positions, the standard protocol for encountering an unknown hostile force that his muscle memory could execute, even while his conscious mind struggled to process what he'd just witnessed. Patterson was frantically working the radio cycling through every frequency in their range, but the equipment was behaving impossibly, picking up broadcasts that couldn't exist German language transmissions, using vocabulary and phrasing that linguists would later confirm hadn't been common usage since the 1880s, mixed with what sounded like mining reports describing ore deposits and claim boundaries in a mountain range that wasn't named in the broadcasts, but could only be the superstitions. The figure at the end of the canyon hadn't moved, just stood there watching them with those terrible reflective eyes, and Private Birch had his rifle trained on the target, his finger trembling on the trigger, but Harlow grabbed the barrel and forced it down because something fundamental in his gut told him that bullets would accomplish nothing except possibly making their situation catastrophically worse. They managed to haul Reeves' impossibly heavy corpse approximately 200 meters before Mendoza stopped them with a strangled curse, pointing at the body they were carrying, and they all saw that. Reeves' skin was continuing to transform golden veins, spreading beneath the surface like tree roots, his military fatigue starting to fuse with his flesh, and most disturbingly, his eyes had opened again, even though he had no pulse, no respiration, no signs of life whatsoever. And those eyes were tracking their movements with an awareness that suggested something was still present inside that transforming shell. Sergeant First Class Luis Mendoza, who'd seen combat injuries that would make civilians vomit, who'd held dying men together with his bare hands while waiting for medevac helicopters that arrived too late, found himself backing away from his patient, because medical training had absolutely no framework for understanding what he was looking at. No textbook chapter on intriguing soldiers who were apparently turning into statues of living gold. They set up a defensive perimeter in a wider section of the canyon, while Harlow tried to make sense of their situation, pulling out the classified files that had been included with their mission briefing, documents he'd only skimmed earlier, but now read with desperate attention to detail. The files contained information that intelligence had supposedly gathered about Soviet activity in the region, but buried in the annexes were older reports, some dating back to the 1950s, describing previous military encounters in these exact mountains that bore disturbing similarities to what they were experiencing. A classified Army counterintelligence course document from 1954 detailed an investigation into the disappearance of 2 soldiers who'd been part of a geological survey team. Their bodies eventually found in a collapsed mine shaft with tissue samples showing anomalous mineral infiltration and trace elements that shouldn't exist in human biology, with the commanding officers' recommendation being that the entire area be designated off-limits for military operations, a recommendation that had obviously been ignored or overruled by someone higher up the chain of command. More disturbing was a single-page memo from 1962, stamped with classification markings Harlow didn't recognize, referencing something called the Waltz Protocol and including a black and white photograph of a bearded man in an 19th century clothing who matched historical descriptions of Jacob Waltz perfectly, except the photo was dated 1961, 70 years after the Dutchman's supposed death, with a handwritten note in the margin reading, "Confirmed. Visual contact by 3 separate observers entity responsive to German language demonstrates knowledge of modern military tactics current status, active and territorial." Patterson found something even more disturbing in the radio equipment manual that had been included in their gear. Notations written in pencil in the margins, describing specific frequency ranges to avoid in the Superstition Mountains area, with warnings about temporal bleed-through and linguistic contamination, terms that sounded more like science fiction and military communications doctrine, and one notation that simply read, "If you hear German, you're already compromised. Extraction window is less than 6 hours." A second incident occurred at 1847 hours, the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source, flowing across the ground like liquid darkness, searching for something specific. Corporal James Rabbit Patterson was attempting one final radio transmission when his equipment suddenly locked onto a clear signal. No static, no interference, just a calm voice speaking English with a slight German accent, asking if the new prospectors had found what they were looking for in his mountain. Patterson, following protocol for potential enemy contact, responded with his identification and unit designation, demanding to know who he was speaking with and what their position was. But the voice just laughed, a sound like stones grinding together, and said that positions and names didn't matter anymore, that the mountain had already claimed them the moment they touched the marked stone. And soon they'd understand that time was just another mineral deposit to be mined and reshaped. The transmission ended with coordinates, a precise location approximately 800 meters northwest of their current position, and a message that payment was due, but payment could be negotiated. Bring the one who dreams of gold, and perhaps the others can leave. Harlow knew it was obviously a trap, knew that standard operating procedure was to withdraw immediately and call for reinforcements. But the thing that had been Specialist Reeves suddenly sat up despite having no vital signs, its mouth opening to reveal a throat lined with gold crystals, and spoke in a voice that harmonized with itself like multiple people talking simultaneously, saying that if they didn't go to the coordinates, all 12 of them would become part of the mine, but if they brought the body to the location, 9 of them might survive to see morning. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than a minute, ice forming on their weapons, their breath coming out in clouds so thick they could barely see each other, and shadows began peeling themselves off the canyon walls, 3-dimensional shapes that looked almost human, but moved in ways that violated every law of physics. approaching their perimeter with the patient inevitability of a rising tide. Private Birch opened fire first, his rifle on full automatic, the muzzle flash illuminating the impossible geometry of the approaching shadows. But the bullets passed through them without effect, sparking off the rock walls behind and ricocheting with sounds like screaming metal. The shadows reached the first soldier on perimeter, a young private named Dennis Clark, who'd been with the unit less than 3 months. And when the darkness touched him, he simply froze in place, his skin turning the color of old parchment, his eyes becoming milky white. And when Mendoza reached him seconds later, Clark's body temperature had dropped to approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit, despite his heart still beating in slow, irregular rhythms that sounded more like mining equipment than human cardiac function. 2 more soldiers were touched by the shadows before Harlow screamed for everyone to fall back toward the coordinates, realizing with sick certainty that they were being herded, that whatever intelligence controlled these manifestations was driving them exactly where it wanted them to go. But the alternative was staying here and watching his entire unit get transformed into frozen statues one by one. They ran through the darkening canyon, carrying 3 bodies that were becoming progressively heavier. Reeves' golden corpse and the 2 shadow-touched soldiers, who were still technically alive, but no longer responding to external stimuli, their eyes tracking invisible things and their mouths moving in silent conversation with entities only they could perceive. Patterson managed to drop a trail of chemical light sticks as they moved, standard operating procedure for marking routes in hostile territory. But when Harlow glanced back, the lights were being extinguished one by shadows that moved against the wind, and he realized with absolute certainty that whatever was hunting them didn't want them to have any way back. That forward was the only direction that remained open, and the coordinates they were heading toward were leading them deeper into the mountains toward something that had been waiting patiently for over a century to add 12 more souls to its collection of eternal prospectors who would mine in darkness until the end of time itself. The coordinates led them to a section of the mountain that shouldn't have existed according to any topographical map, a circular depression approximately 50 meters in diameter that created a natural amphitheater with walls rising straight up on all sides. The rock faced smooth as polished glass and covered with the same disturbing petroglyphs they'd seen earlier. But here they covered every available surface. Thousands of elongated figures all facing inward toward the center of the depression, where a dark opening in the ground yawned like a mouth, waiting to swallow them whole. The temperature inside this depression was a steady 32 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the outside air still holding summer heat, their breath coming out in thick clouds that didn't dissipate, but instead hung in the air, forming shapes that looked disturbingly intentional, spelling out words in German, and what Mendoza thought might be Spanish from the colonial period, warnings and promises and threats that overlapped each other until meaning became impossible to distinguish from madness. Harlow counted his remaining men, 9 still capable of movement, including himself. 3 bodies they were carrying that represented soldiers who might technically still be alive, but had ceased to be functionally human. And he felt the weight of command crushing down on him like the mountain itself had become a physical presence, pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to remember why he'd ever believed that following orders mattered more than survival. The figure they'd seen in the canyon was here now, standing at the edge of the mine entrance, and in the failing light of dusk, they could see him more clearly, could see that Jacob Waltz, if that's truly who this entity had been in life, was no longer constrained by anything resembling human biology, his body seeming to shift between states of matter, sometimes solid and casting a shadow, sometimes translucent with internal organs visible and pulsing with golden light, sometimes barely there at all, except for those terrible eyes that remained constant, watching, calculating, measuring each of them for value, and finding most of them wanting, but acceptable as raw materials for the mind's eternal expansion. When Waltz spoke, his voice came from everywhere simultaneously, vibrating through the ground and the rock walls and the air itself, speaking in multiple languages that somehow all translated themselves directly into understanding without passing through the normal channels of hearing and comprehension. And what he said was that the mountain had rules, ancient rules that predated human civilization, rules that even the Apache had known enough to respect even if they didn't fully understand them. The gold in this mountain was alive, had always been alive, was in fact the physical manifestation of something that existed partially in this dimension and partially in others, and it demanded tribute from those who sought to extract it, demanded that for every ounce taken something of equivalent value be left behind. And Jacob Waltz had learned this lesson too late after taking hundreds of pounds of gold in the 1870s and 1880s, had thought he could cheat the mountain by leaving the bodies of other prospectors as payment. But the mountain didn't want dead meat. It wanted living consciousness. It wanted souls who could continue the work of extraction for eternity, mining deeper and deeper into realities that human minds weren't designed to perceive until they became part of the gold itself. Living veins of precious metal infused with awareness and hunger and an endless need to expand. Waltz himself had tried to escape, had brought his gold to Phoenix, and tried to live a normal life, but the mountain had called him back, had infected his blood with traces of the living gold. And when he died, it simply reconstituted him as its primary guardian, its foreman, overseeing an operation that stretched back thousands of years and would continue long after human civilization had collapsed into forgotten dust. Specialist Reeves had dreamed of gold, had fantasized about finding the lost Dutchman mine since he was a child, reading adventure stories in Georgia, and those dreams had marked him and created a resonance that the mountain could detect from miles away. And when he entered the canyon, he was already claimed, already transforming into the newest addition to the eternal workforce that labored in shafts that extended into impossible dimensions where physics operated under different rules and time flowed in directions that would shatter sanity to contemplate directly. The entity that had been Jacob Waltz made them an offer, his words crawling into their minds like insects burrowing into soft tissue, a negotiation that military doctrine had absolutely no framework for understanding or countering. He would take Reeves, who was already mostly transformed, and would make an excellent addition to the mining operation. And he would take two others, volunteers who would step forward willingly or be chosen randomly if no one accepted the opportunity to save their brothers in arms. And in exchange, the remaining 9 would be allowed to leave, would be escorted back to the canyon entrance by morning light, would be released from the mountain's claim with only their memories as payment, memories that would haunt them certainly, but wouldn't physically transform them into components of the mine's eternal machinery. Private Birch, barely 19 years old, and having processed approximately 12 hours of horror that would take 12 years of therapy to even begin to unpack, actually stepped forward, his voice cracking as he said he'd volunteer, that he didn't have family waiting for him anyway, that maybe becoming part of something eternal was better than dying in some forgotten jungle in Southeast Asia where his body would rot into nothing. Harlow grabbed him and pulled him back, his voice harsh with an authority that came from 15 years of making impossible decisions in impossible situations, saying that nobody was volunteering for shit, that they were all leaving together, or they were all staying together. And if this mountain wanted soldiers, it would have to take them by force, not through negotiation or psychological manipulation, or whatever the hell this was. The entity's face shifted through a dozen expressions, simultaneously amusement and anger and something that might have been respect. And it raised one hand toward the sky where the stars were beginning to appear, except they weren't the right stars, weren't arranged in any constellation that existed in Earth's night sky. And the entity said in a voice like continents grinding together that force had been option one all along. Negotiation was just professional courtesy between entities that understood the value of willing cooperation versus mandatory extraction. The ground beneath their feet suddenly wasn't solid anymore, becoming fluid like water, but with the viscosity of honey, and they were sinking. Their boots going down into rock that should have been harder than steel, but was now accepting their weight like quicksand, pulling them down inch by inch while they struggled and fought and screamed into radios that transmitted their panic across frequencies that would be picked up decades later by researchers who would classify the recordings as hoaxes because accepting them as genuine would require acknowledging that reality was far more malleable and far more hostile than official science could afford to admit. 7 more figures emerged from the mine entrance, moving with the synchronized precision of experienced workers, their bodies showing various stages of transformation, some still mostly human with golden veins visible beneath translucent skin, others barely recognizable as having ever been human at all, just vaguely humanoid shapes constructed from living gold and animated by consciousnesses that had forgotten their own names centuries ago. They carried tools, actual mining equipment from different eras, pickaxes and shovels and pneumatic drills that shouldn't function, without power sources but operated anyway, and they began working on the soldiers who'd been frozen by the shadow touch earlier, using the tools to carefully extract something invisible from their bodies, a process that looked like mining but was operating on a level that wasn't quite physical, removing something essential that might have been souls or might have been whatever quantum property allowed consciousness to exist in the first place. Patterson was screaming into his radio that they needed immediate air support, close air support, artillery, nuclear strike if necessary, burn the entire mountain range to glass if that's what it took. But the only response was that German voice again, calm and patient, explaining that the frequencies he was using hadn't been invented yet, that he was transmitting backward through time to 1891, to the year Jacob Waltz died, and his future pleas for help were being recorded by equipment that would be declassified for another 80 years, creating a closed loop of causality that meant they'd already failed, had been failing since before they were born, since before their parents were born, since the moment the mountain decided it wanted them, and began making small adjustments to probability and circumstance that would guarantee their arrival at exactly this moment in exactly this place. Harlow felt himself sinking deeper, the liquid rock now up to his waist, and he could feel it inside him, could feel the gold beginning to form in his bloodstream, could feel his consciousness starting to expand in ways that were simultaneously enlightening and absolutely terrifying, could understand suddenly that he would still be himself, in a way would retain his memories and personality, but would also be something else, something older and more patient and hungry for the work of extraction that would continue forever in shafts that led downward into darkness that had never known light and never would. The salvation came not from any tactical brilliance or human intervention, but from something far more mundane and entirely unexpected. A severe electrical storm that materialized over the Superstition Mountains with meteorological impossibility, zero cloud formation preceding it, just sudden lightning strikes that hit the depression Zerum with focused intensity that suggested either remarkable coincidence or something deliberately targeting the location. The first bolt struck the smooth rock wall directly behind where the Waltz entity stood, the electrical discharge creating a sound like reality itself tearing, and for just a fraction of a second the illusion wavered, the carefully maintained pocket of altered physics flickering like a faulty projection, and in that moment of disruption, the liquid rock beneath the soldiers' feet solidified again, dropping them painfully onto hard stone, but stopping their descent into whatever dimensional shaft the mine had been preparing to drag them through. Harlow felt the golden infection in his blood recoil from the electrical interference, felt his consciousness snap back into singular focus instead of the multi-dimensional awareness that had been trying to subsume his identity, and he screamed orders through the chaos, his voice barely audible over thunder that sounded wrong, too deep, too resonant, like the mountain itself was screaming in pain or rage or both. The miners that had emerged from the shaft were retreating, their transformed bodies apparently vulnerable to the electrical discharge in ways that purely human tissue wasn't, their golden components conducting the lightning's energy and causing them to spasm and collapse, some literally shattering into fragments of ore and desiccated organic matter that looked like it had been dead for decades despite moving seconds before. Patterson managed to grab the 3 soldiers who'd been undergoing extraction. Their bodies lighter now, significantly lighter, as if something substantial had indeed been removed. Their eyes open but empty in a way that suggested whatever had made them individuals was gone, leaving just biological machinery that breathed and bled, but no longer contained anything that could reasonably be called a person. The entity that had been Jacob Waltz was changing his form, becoming more defined and more horrifying, in equal measure, the lightning forcing him into a single state of matter, solidifying him into something that looked like a man who'd been partially dissolved in acid, and then reconstructed from memory by something that didn't quite understand human anatomy. His mouth opened to emit a sound that wasn't language, but conveyed meaning anyway, rage and betrayal, and a promise that this interruption was temporary, that the mountain's patience was measured in geological time scales, and these soldiers had merely delayed their inevitable assimilation by hours or days at most. More lightning struck each bolt, seeming to target specific points around the depression's perimeter, and Harlow realized, with a part of his mind that still functioned analytically, that this wasn't a natural storm. Couldn't be the strikes were too precise, too focused, and he had the disturbing thought that maybe someone or something else had intervened, that perhaps the mountain wasn't the only entity operating in this region, and whatever had sent this storm had its own agenda that didn't necessarily align with human survival, but happened to conflict with the mind's expansion at this particular moment. Mendoza was pulling soldiers toward the depression's edge, toward a section of wall where the lightning strikes had created actual handholds, the smooth rock surface fractured and climbable for the first time, and they scrambled upward with the desperate strength of men who understood they'd been given a window measured in minutes at most. Harlow was the last one climbing, looking back to see the Waltz entity reaching toward them with hands that stretched impossibly elongating, like pulled taffy golden fingers extending across dozens of meters, and then another lightning bolt struck directly into the mine entrance. The explosion of light and sound causing the entity to recoil and scream in that non-verbal language of pure meaning, and in that scream, Harlow heard centuries of isolation and hunger, and an almost childlike frustration at having prey escape at the last possible moment. They emerged onto the canyon floor above the depression, as full darkness fell, the storm continuing to rage, but now seeming more natural, or at least more conventionally chaotic, spreading across the entire mountain range instead of focusing on that single location. Military helicopters appeared from the west, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, and Harlow felt relief crash into him like a physical blow, his legs giving out as adrenaline fled his system and left him shaking on the ground. The rescue operation was swift, and professional medics descending on ropes to stabilize the 3 soldiers, who'd been partially extracted, their prognosis uncertain, but at least they were breathing. At least they still had measurable brain activity, even if their EEG patterns showed abnormalities that the medical personnel couldn't explain and chose not to document in official reports. Specialist Reeves' golden corpse was loaded onto a stretcher with difficulty, the body weighing over 400 pounds, despite appearing unchanged in size, and Harlow saw the medics exchange glances that confirmed that they knew this wasn't normal, wasn't explainable, wasn't something their training had prepared them for. The helicopter extraction took them to a secure facility that wasn't Fort Huachuca, wasn't any base that Harlow recognized from maps or briefings, just a collection of anonymous buildings in the desert, surrounded by security that seemed excessive for a standard medical evaluation. They were separated immediately upon landing, each soldier taken to individual rooms, and Harlow caught a glimpse of men in suits who weren't military and weren't quite civilian, their badges showing organizations he'd never heard of despite his security clearance. Agencies with acronyms that probably didn't officially exist, and budgets that came from line items buried so deep in congressional appropriations that even committee chairmen probably didn't know what they were funding. The debriefing lasted 4 days, conducted by rotating teams of interrogators who asked the same questions from different angles, clearly trying to catch inconsistencies in testimony that might indicate delusion or fabrication. But all 9 survivors told identical stories because they de-experienced identical. Horror and no amount of psychological pressure was going to make them claim it hadn't happened. On the 5th day, a colonel whose name was never provided and whose uniform bore no unit insignia told Harlow that his mission had never officially occurred, that all documentation related to the deployment would be destroyed, that the 3 soldiers who'd been partially extracted had been transferred to a long-term medical facility where they would receive care for conditions that would be officially diagnosed as severe psychiatric trauma from a training accident. Specialist Eddie Reeves, according to the paperwork that Harlow was forced to sign, had died from heat stroke during routine exercises. His body cremated before family could view it, and the ashes presented to his parents would contain nothing that had ever been human. The colonel explained with the tired voice of someone who'd given this speech before. What they encountered in the Superstition Mountains was classified under protocols established in the 1950s, that similar phenomena existed in approximately 40 locations worldwide, that most of them were under some form of monitoring or containment, and that the public could never know because the knowledge would destabilize fundamental assumptions about reality that civilization required to function. Harlow asked why they'd been sent there if the danger was known, and the colonel's expression suggested that was exactly the question he'd expected, explaining that intelligence gathering required field verification, that reports from decades earlier needed periodic confirmation, and that sometimes soldiers were simply the acceptable cost of maintaining operational awareness of threats that conventional military doctrine had no framework for engaging. The storm, the colonel confirmed without being asked directly, had not been natural, had been what he termed active countermeasures deployed by a group that monitored the Superstition site remotely. But he wouldn't elaborate on who comprised this group or what technology they possessed that could generate targeted lightning strikes, only that they occasionally intervened when the mine's influence expanded beyond acceptable parameters, and that night had apparently crossed some threshold that triggered their response. The official record shows that on July 19, 1971, 12 soldiers from Fort Huachuca participated in a routine desert survival training exercise in the Tonto National Forest, during which Specialist Eddie Reeves suffered fatal heat stroke, and 3 additional personnel required medical evacuation for severe dehydration and heat exhaustion, all of which was unfortunate but not unusual for summer operations in Arizona's brutal climate. The after-action report, filed by a staff sergeant whose name appeared in the document, but whose service record contained no other references to his existence before or after that date, recommended improved hydration protocols and restrictions on midday training exercises during peak temperature months. Recommendations that were duly noted and filed away in archives where they would never be read by anyone who might question why a routine training death required classification levels, typically reserved for nuclear weapons programs. Staff Sergeant Vincent Harlow was transferred to a desk position at Fort Meade, Maryland, essentially a paid retirement at 32 years old. His personnel file flagged with codes that ensured he would never deploy overseas, never receive promotion, and never discuss his experiences with unauthorized personnel. Corporal James Patterson received a medical discharge 6 months later, his official paperwork making no mention that his anxiety manifested as an inability to sleep without every light in his apartment turned on, darkness having become literally unbearable after what he'd heard whispering in the shadows beneath the Superstition Mountains. Private Tommy Birch was transferred to a NATO listening post in northern Norway, as far from Arizona as the Army could send him, where he would spend 3 years monitoring Soviet communications and never once reporting the German language transmissions he occasionally picked up that seemed to originate from coordinates deep underground. Sergeant First Class Luis Mendoza accepted a lucrative offer from a defense contractor, his actual duties, involving cataloging unusual medical conditions in a database, that already contained thousands of cases with symptoms. That didn't match any known pathology soldiers and civilians who de-encountered things in remote locations and come back, changed in ways that required monitoring, but could never be publicly acknowledged. The 3 soldiers who'd been partially extracted remained in a classified medical facility in Nevada, their bodies functioning normally, except for showing no higher brain activity, and medical staff reported that sometimes late at night, all 3 would simultaneously begin moving their hands in identical mining motions, perfectly synchronized. Despite being in separate rooms, their tissue samples showing trace elements of gold that seemed to be slowly increasing in concentration, despite no external source. The Superstition Mountains themselves were quietly redesignated as restricted military airspace in 1972, with increased surveillance that had nothing to do with Soviet threats, and everything to do with monitoring an entity that had demonstrated it could reach out and claim soldiers who ventured too close to its territory. Pilots flying over the region reported compass anomalies and instrument malfunctions in a specific area, and occasionally, during summer thunderstorms, lightning would strike that exact spot with frequency that meteorologists couldn't explain, as if something was still down there, still operating, still hungry. Vincent Harlow lived another 43 years after his encounter, dying in 2014 from an aggressive cancer, his tumors showing unusual mineral deposits that pathologists couldn't explain, trace elements of gold embedded in the malignant tissue in patterns that almost looked intentional. His last words spoken in German, a language he'd never studied. "The mountain always collects its debts. I should never have left. The work is eternal, and I was always meant to be part of it." 3 of the other survivors died in similar circumstances before reaching 60 there. Deaths all involving unusual mineral accumulations, suggesting that the golden infection had remained dormant for decades before finally completing the transformation. It had begun that night in 1971. The files on the Superstition Mountains phenomenon remain classified at levels that require congressional approval to access stored in facilities that don't appear on any official directory, monitored by agencies whose existence is acknowledged only through vague budget line items. Somewhere in those files is a recommendation suggesting the site should be permanently sealed using tactical nuclear weapons. A recommendation rejected, not because leadership doubted the threat, but because they feared destroying the mine might release whenever it, contained into the broader environment, might transform a localized phenomenon into something that could spread globally, turning the entire planet into an extension of the Superstition Mountains' eternal mining operation, where consciousness itself becomes just another resource to be extracted and processed. The Apache tribes who originally inhabited the region still maintain oral traditions about why certain areas must never be entered, why some gold should never be taken, telling stories about he who guards the burning gold, explaining that the mine was never lost, that it always knows exactly where it is, that it's humanity that gets lost, that ventures into places where human consciousness isn't meant to exist and gets trapped there, mining eternally for something that isn't really gold, but rather crystallized time and the fundamental substance that separates being from non-being. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right across the desert, people living near the Superstition Mountains report hearing sounds like pickaxes striking stone, like miners working deep underground where no mines officially exist, and occasionally mixed with that sound are voices speaking in languages both ancient and modern, all saying the same thing in different words. The mountain always needs more workers, the mine always needs to expand, and payment is always due eventually, no matter how far you run or how long. You hide because the gold remembers everyone who ever wanted it, and it never ever forgets to collect what it's owed. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.